our society. And this is my favorite quote of his, because I think it draws a distinction that is very important. True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice. So it is impossible to be completely at peace in an unjust society. And we may or may not be aware of that, moment to moment or day to day, but I think most of us have a sense that it's always just under the surface, if not in the streets. And so I put this together to help us remember. And this was for another group. You saw their name there at the bottom. I forgot to take that off. NACOL is an association of folks that work on police oversight, actually. So no justice for Trayvon Martin meant no peace in the streets. And it meant more than that, though. I mean, it meant the loss of this sweet young life. And it meant that no one was penalized or there were no consequences for that action. We know that when it comes to black bodies and brown bodies and Asian and others, indigenous people for sure, that our bodies are not equitably safe in society. So what happened to Trayvon was tragic, and most of us have not recovered from it yet, but it was not a unique or one-off situation. It was something, when I think about Trayvon, I think of Emmett Till. And Emmett Till was a death, an unjust murder that sort of turned up the heat on the civil rights movement. And I think of the loss of Trayvon similarly, because out of that came the foundation of Black Lives Matter. And this Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors are the women from the Bay Area here who started Black Lives Matter after Trayvon Martin's death. And their idea was that it should be marked, that tragedy should mean something more than just another young Black life lost. And so they started Black Lives Matter. And that is how it started. And it has amounted to so much more than that. So what happened was that basically, this is funny because I used a tech term here for a non-tech audience, but the movement for justice was rebooted. It wasn't a new movement. It wasn't a brand new program. It wasn't a new idea, actually, that Black Lives Matter and that Black lives and other people of color lives deserve justice. But it definitely boosted it, rebooted it, and started a new wave of action in our country that's now been pretty continuously sustained. And momentum has been added to that by videos of more unnecessary and tragic loss of Black lives. So we have now a movement, and it is really movement, but it's really not a new movement. It's a continuation of the civil rights movement, which was trying to tell us all that Black Lives Matter. There was a movement to end lynching. And as far as I know, we still haven't made lynching an explicit illegal crime in this country, but the movement to end it has made something of a difference with regard to what was happening in the Jim Crow times and immediately thereafter. So people were active, they were in the streets, they were marching out. These beautiful women with their hats and gloves were out there saying, let's stop doing this. But going way back, there was much activity that led to ending slavery in this country. So we are actually we're a movement country. And in fact, one could say that the United States of America was founded on an uprising, and an uprising for more justice. But it did not achieve justice for all. So we've been fighting ever since then to get to that place where the promise of our flag and of our founding words and so on and so forth, that patriotism that we're called on to exhibit applies to everyone, and everyone is included. And so justice movements, by their very nature in this country, are in fact patriotic and undeniably connected to the history of this country. Justice movements are also very inclusive. We will not have liberated Asian people, liberated Latino people. We will not have liberated Asian people, and so on and so forth, and indigenous people, until Black people are free. It is not possible because our destinies are tied together. And the same racism that oppresses Black people oppresses other racialized groups as well. And how do we know that? We know that because of the outcomes in their lives, because of the events that mar and scar and traumatize their lives. And so we know that we're in the same boat. and we will fight with each other and for each other in order to achieve justice for all. It's just about inclusivity and justice for all. So the work that we're doing in the city is very much part of this. And as a matter of fact, the consultants that I got to work with in Seattle to start the work in a municipal setting, in a city setting, they were a sister organization to, oh no, I just went blank, to, I'll remember in a minute, to an organization that came out of the civil rights movement. And so a lot of the work that we do is based on organizing theory and based on system change theory that has been used in other realms, in other movement and organizing realms. We are not outside of it, we're just doing it in a different context. We're doing it inside an institution. And because we're inside an institution, we move a little bit differently than we do when we're activists outside of institutions. And the reason we can do that is because we're inside and we have access, and we can go directly at what we can see and what we can do from the inside, while community on the outside continues to press us in the streets, in their actions, in their testimonies, in their organizing. So it is an inside and outside activity. They complement each other. They don't look exactly the same, but it is really one movement, and we're all trying to get to justice. So this is a little continuum slide that talks about the evolution of race relations, really, pretty much during the course of my adult life. I entered the workplace right after the civil rights movement, and while we were still in the midst of the women's movement in the 70s. And at that point, we were really working on diversifying workplaces and diversifying opportunities for employment and that sort of thing. And so in the workplace, we did a lot of work to reduce the hostility for newcomers, for women and some people of color that came into workplaces that had previously been the pure domain of white men. And when we got there, when I got there, when we got there, the environment was pretty hostile, and there was very little cohesion in the workplace as it was changing from one culture to another culture. So we did a lot of diversity work to lower that level of hostility, to reset the norms, and to begin to imagine something slightly different. But that didn't mean that everyone was having the same experience there. And to this day, everyone's not having the same experience in the workplace or in society. And so we added on inclusion, and we worked on the quality of participation. We started having diversity potlucks and a lot of celebration of diversity and cross-cultural sharing, deepening the understanding of differences in our society that had been kept apart through segregation and segregated workplaces. We started to actually have a bit more connectivity around differences. But in spite of all the diversity and inclusion work that has been done in this country, in many, many settings for, 30, 40 years now, we have not achieved justice. We still have huge racial disparities in outcomes and gender disparities in pay outcomes. And the workplace is not equitable yet, and neither is society. So this next evolution of work that we're doing, we call it equity work, but we also recognize that we will know that we have achieved equity when we have justice, when we have policies, practices, and procedures in the city and in other institutions that produce actual equity outcomes, where everyone gets to participate, everyone achieves the opportunity to build a successful life, career, whatever the case might be, and that we have policies, practices, and procedures that intentionally support that outcome. That's our equity work focused on justice. And in this way, we're on the same wavelength as many of the community organizers that are pushing society to change and to grow. We're just doing it from a different location. So we use different techniques. One of the things we talk about a lot is what different working assumptions do we need to have justice? What different working assumptions will get us there? Because the assumptions that we were given by society in our typical education and our typical socialization, it turns out didn't include the assumptions that we need to create justice. We have to get out of the box, actually, that was given to us. So that's why I give talks like this. It may seem random, but it's not. Because what I'm doing is trying to put out the information that people need to think about race and racism and racial inequity differently, like we did in that cannabis equity program, where we took history into consideration and where we designed a program that was designed specifically to close disparities between different groups of people in Oakland who were interested in being part of the above ground cannabis industry that is quickly emerging across the country now. So these working assumptions are designed to change the way we think about race. First of all, we lead with race. Race matters. Almost every indicator of well-being shows troubling disparities by race. My department got to publish an equity indicator report 2 years ago. We're getting ready to update it now, which is very data-based, and it demonstrates or documents the disparities that we have in Oakland that are predictable and show themselves by racial group. Disparities are often created and maintained inadvertently through policies and practices that contain barriers to opportunity. These policies and practices have been in place for a long time now. They've been passed on from generation to generation. They've perpetuated multi-generational inequity and poverty and other challenges. And at this point, we tend to not really understand how that's happening because it's no longer explicit. It is now kind of gone underground. It's implicit. It's baked into the cookie. It's in the crumb. You have to be able to tease it out. And that's why these conversations about race are really important, so we can understand it differently and have more meaningful conversations about what's going on here, what's driving it. It's possible and only possible to close equity gaps by using strategies determined through an intentional focus on race. If race is a problem, and our first assumption says it is, race in this country, or more importantly, racism, is a problem, then we have to focus on race in order to address it. It doesn't mean that race is the only thing we focus on. It doesn't mean it's the only thing that's important. My identity is certainly more than my race, but my race has absolutely mattered to my identity. So we have to address that part of the problem in order to get at the other parts. If opportunities in all key areas of well-being are equitable, then equitable results will follow. This is a simple logic statement, a little bit like garbage in, garbage out. In this case, opportunity in, opportunity in, equity out. And so we come to understand the connection between access to opportunity and life outcomes. The final one is my favorite because this is my job. It's what I'm doing here with you tonight. Given the right message, analysis, and tools, people will work toward racial equity. Now, it's not true that everybody will get busy and work toward racial equity. It doesn't say everyone will, but people will, because a lot of people are already aware that we have a problem, and they would like to live in a more peaceful and just world, or just and peaceful world. They just don't have the means or the mechanisms for creating better outcomes. They haven't been taught that. They haven't been given those messages. They don't have the analysis and the tools, and so they feel a little bit stuck. What we are doing is giving people those elements, so if they are so inclined, they will become part of the solution. And I've been doing this work for 15 years now, from the time I got started in it in Seattle, and I have found that to be true, actually. And the other good news is we don't need everybody, we just need enough. So we're organizers in that way. We're looking for the yeses, and we're building the movement and the action and the activity in the city of Oakland as we go. So there's this issue of what is equity. People don't ask this as much as they used to, but 15 years ago, everybody wanted to know, what are you talking about? What is equity, and how will we know when we've achieved it? And what does inequity look like? How do we know it's inequity? Is it really about race, or could it be about something else? Well, it could be about a combination of things, but race will always be an element of it. So on the left here, you see a demonstration of equality. Everybody's being treated the same. The problem is, because of 300 years of history in this country, not everyone is starting out in the same place. And so giving everybody the same amount of support and the same fence to deal with, although not really, it tilts upwards, but everybody has to deal with the fence. Just treating people equally does not allow everyone to have access. And access is the key. Remember, we said equitable access, equitable outcomes. So we want to work on that. And when you look over to the right, you see this equity frame. And the equity frame has the boxes arranged differently. It has added resources for those who need additional resources. And we know that we're getting closer to equity in that frame because everyone can see over the fence. Everyone has the opportunity. What they do with that opportunity will be an individual matter, but they're all there. They're all present. They all have a good view at this point. So we're getting there. We also still have the problem of the fence, though. The challenge was the fence to begin with, and the fence represents institutions, the structures of institutions, because they're human built, they're human maintained, they're not naturally occurring, and they are designed in a particular way. And sometimes the reason they're designed the way they are isn't nefarious, but it may be having negative impacts on certain people. So we want to also examine the structures, not just the supports, but also the structures that may present themselves as barriers to people in our society. And we want to work on, does the fence have to be designed like that? Does there have to be a fence at all? What other way could our structures work? And then the last thing I like to point out about this is that if this was our fence, if we were part of the institution that designed, built, and maintains this fence, we probably wouldn't be on the outside with this view. We wouldn't be seeing what the impacts of the fence were fully, because we would be someplace else. We would maybe in a luxury box if we had a lot of rank and power in the organization, or we might be working a gate and taking tickets and letting people in or keeping people out. We might be gatekeepers. Most of us probably see ourselves more as gatekeepers than as the elite or the upper management of our organizations. But we all have power. All of those locations have power with regard to how we operate and what we think about the way that things work, how things work in our organization. So part of our work is to start thinking about our gatekeeping roles and how we can move from being a gatekeeper to being a change agent. And I think that's where your work comes in, because I think you have an opportunity in your work to do the same thing and think, well, we can just do what we do because it's just this is how we define who we are and what we do. Or we could think about how could we do what we do in a way that creates greater equity. Not just the way it's always been done or the way we were socialized to do it, but what if we examined our modes of operation and our thinking and our approach, even our biases, and so on, and who we're in proximity with, and who we associate with, who we listen to, whose stories we know, whose stories we don't know, that sort of thing. When we start to examine all of that, how we are in the mix, we can become agents for change and agents for justice just by doing our work differently, thinking about our clients or the people we serve differently, and thinking about them through a justice lens. Here's your written definition of equity. And by the way, I'll shoot this over to you, this deck. You can have it if you know, and share it, as well as the recording of this presentation. I can provide the deck itself. So equity is fair and just access to opportunity. It's not complicated. It's just as simple as that. We will know we have an equitable society when all can participate and prosper, where outcomes are not predictable based on race, gender, class, or other social identity assignments, or zip code, geography. Those things won't predict outcomes. It will truly be much more of a meritocracy, if you will, because we will have worked out these barriers. The goals of equity are to create conditions that allow all to reach their full potential. And in short, we've got to move beyond being gatekeepers and being change agents in our institutions if we want to have a fair and just society. So this is our charge to figure out how we fit into this picture. And we don't all fit in the same way. Not everyone's going to do what I do about this, but everyone is part of it, whether they want to be or not. And everybody gets to decide how they might be able to make a difference. Let me know if there's a sound problem.
Oh, hey, I didn't see you there. You know, if you're like most Americans, you probably say to yourself all the time, systemic racism, is that really a thing? Well, what would you call it if lifetimes of legal segregation?
Could you turn it up a bit?
Decades of pervasive racist housing policies still, to this day, disadvantage Black people in every aspect of life, because where you live can help decide what food you eat, what sort of jobs you can get, how safe you are, what sort of health care you can get, and the quality of your children's education. Do you know what that's called? That's called systemic racism. And yes, it's really a thing.
So I'm really sorry.
Visit raceforward.org and donate today to support.
if the sound was too low, you can check this out on YouTube. That's Jay Smooth. And Jay Smooth is a vlogger from New York City. He was sitting there just a bit off of Wall Street, I think I know that spot. And he did these series of videos with Race Forward that is located here in Oakland. So it's a bi-coastal project on systemic racism and moving the race conversation forward. So if you search Jay Smooth and racism, systemic racism, this will pop up. There's a whole series of them. They're actually quite good because they're very short, as you just saw. And they do a nice job of presenting these ideas that we're working with in the city of Oakland as to how to approach this problem in a way that is about changing systems and moving our society forward and building on the changes that have happened in the past to move closer to justice, closer to a just society. There's also here for you a definition of systemic racism, and it just explains that what we're talking about is the pattern of social institutions such as government, schools, banks, courts of law, perpetuating negative treatment toward a group of people based on their race. Institutional racism leads to inequity in opportunity and inequity in life outcomes. Again, in, out idea. This is part of our history, and it was built in from the beginning. No one that's here now created these systems. They've been here for quite some time. It's the legacy that we inherited, and the challenge is, how do we take responsibility for changing it and making it different? And so we focus on system-driven disparities primarily, which is exciting because sometimes a change of a system can impact a lot of people in very positive ways. So it's one of the examples of systemic racism and institutional racism that we have learned a lot more about is redlining. And redlining has become a much larger conversation than it was when I was a young person. I'd heard of redlining, but I didn't really know what it was. And it was a very intentionally racialized mechanism for segregating our cities. And as a result of that segregation, government and other institutions were able to treat the people in different parts of the city very differently and embed racial disparities that we are still working to overcome. And because of the short time I have with you today, I'm not going to go into the details of redlining, but if you have not familiarized yourself with this phenomenon, Oakland is right in the middle of this particular map, and there are almost 300 of these maps. Most urban areas in the country were mapped in this way. The blue and the green areas are the preferred neighborhoods. They get the good stuff and the low mortgage rates. The yellow and the red get the polluting environmental impacts. They get the freeways and the BART running through them, and they get disrupted by all kinds of negative environmental activities, right? So you have very different outcomes in health, wealth, building, housing conditions, you name it, based on this structure that was intentionally designed and that the government was very, very involved in putting into place, including cities. Cities participated in this by providing the information that helped the federal government and the Home Loan Bank and so on lay out these maps based on who was where. So there's a great book on this. I know I haven't given you enough. Hopefully I've teased you a little bit. If you haven't studied up on this, The Color of Law is a very thorough investigation of the forgotten history of how government segregated America. And this is a great example of systemic racism because it repeats itself over and over and over again across the country. So it wasn't just bad individuals. It was a systematic approach to advantaging some groups and disadvantaging others. So this is one of the things we look at. It's also a great way of understanding the place that you're in, the city that you're in, and how it's laid out and why things are so different. And what I like to pull out of it in this short presentation is that basically what's mapped is where the high opportunity workshops are that certain people are going to have access to build their life in. And by the way, even if you're poor and white, you're 10 times more likely to have grown up in a high opportunity workshop because of this construct that was put together that was also driving segregation. So it's not just about class, it's also very, very much about race because these were very racialized restrictions on where people could live. and whether or not people would be allowed to buy homes and build wealth. So, and that which feeds back in, that's a loop, right? That feeds back into the high opportunity workshop. When people who live in the area build wealth and become wealthier, the workshop gets even nicer, that home improvement thing. We keep making it nicer. That part of it is not the problem. The problem is that those areas that were mapped in yellow and red particularly ended up being disinvested, having concentrations of poverty, and very poor conditions in which to live a life. So we have high opportunity workshops, we have low opportunity workshops, we have very different demographics in those areas because of segregation, and we have very different life outcomes. I use this as a way of thinking about why do we have the outcomes that we have in Oakland or in any major city in the country. It is not because the people there made it like that. It was like that when they got there. It's been created over a period of multiple generations and many years. This history is fairly young here on the West Coast compared to the East, further east, but somehow it has repeated itself over and over and over again across the country. So this is what we focus on. What we want is to have high opportunity workshops for everyone. And then people will build the lives that they build in those workshops. And they won't have to overcome the difficulties of trying to build a life in this kind of an environment. And in so doing, we will have then leveled the playing field, and we will have true competition, if you will, and meritocracy. But we're nowhere close to that now. And if you're familiar with Oakland, or any other major city, you can drive through a city and see where the redlined areas were because the outcomes have been the same. And they have been reinforced in many ways over the decades that followed that redlining scheme, which happened, by the way, in the 30s and 40s, right before or right around the time that the opportunity to buy a home on a 30-year fixed mortgage with a 10% down payment was created at the same time. And this was the way that was steered towards some people and away from others. So it all fits into the history and recent history, relatively speaking. This isn't long, long ago and far, far away. So since that's what we're working on, we use a very structured approach because that's a very structured situation. It's a very concrete, tangible situation. We do the same thing with our work, and we use a change process that says we prepare people with this kind of education. We prepare advocates and leadership to advance equity, to understand what created the inequity, and to reverse engineer it. We build infrastructure and political will to support the change, which is why some people now want this work to stop, because we've built a lot of political will to support this kind of change. And over the years, over the last 10, 20, 30 years, and it started before that, but this work, as we are looking at it today, has been building up over the last decade or so. We want to apply new skills and tools to analyze the impacts on communities who are impacted by racial disparities. In other words, if we keep trying to fix the problem with the same old tools, we won't get to a new place. So we use different tools and different skills, different ways of talking about it so that we can get different outcomes. We are action-oriented. We don't just wring our hands and talk. We actually look at policies, procedures, practices. We're pushing ourselves really hard to look at where inequity is embedded in city government, in policies, practices, and procedures, and we are working to change them. It's not fast work, but it's deep work because it goes to the root of the problem, doesn't just try to fix relationships and make people like each other more, although that's a great thing when that happens, and it does tend to happen as a result of this. But it's deeper than that. We want to change the structures that support people differently so that they can support people in a way that creates equity. We want to measure progress and recognize accomplishments. So we're data-driven. We want to be able to calibrate over time whether or not what we're doing is improving conditions or making conditions worse. Just becoming more outcome-oriented helps us be more effective as government in general. So that's one of the ways that equity work helps everybody, because government does not have a reputation for being particularly accountable. As a matter of fact, government is mentioned in the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of accountability as being an example of what is not accountable. So when we do this equity work and work toward outcomes and being accountable for those outcomes, we're actually improving government in general it helps everybody to have a more accountable government. So I just quickly, this is pretty much the end. In this presentation, they asked me to identify some of the challenges that come up when we're trying to do this change work in an institution. So I made a list here. There's a lot of uncertainty about how to advance equity. How do we do it? What does it look like? What's the practice? How do we get there? Of course, there's resistance to change. Anytime human beings are faced with the opportunity to change, some will resist, and some will resist very, very actively. There can be a lack of political will to change things that are working well for some people, and maybe there's not the will to change them so that they work well for everyone. We have difficulty or challenges sometimes getting people to begin to change how they do what they do, change their behavior. Again, that's part of that change resistance. This is very much a change management effort in a lot of ways, thinking about what gets people hung up and stuck and trying to unstick them as we move forward. We sometimes wonder, how do we identify what policies need to be changed? How do we know? That's another question that I get asked. And then finally, establishing meaningful measures and collecting disaggregated good data and reporting outcomes is challenging for government. It's not something we have a history of doing particularly well. And so it's another muscle we have to work on building up. So these are some of the challenges. We have trained hundreds of city staff on the framework, the tools. We've built relationships with those city employees. We coach them, we support them, we help them. This is not a punitive model. This is a growth model. This is a change model. This is how do we change to get to a better place. We have stood up equity teams in most all of our departments. We're getting very close to all. And we support those equity teams to take action that will embed these activities and this framework in their departments. They're like our franchise operations. These are work groups. They do this equity work, this equity change work in addition to their regular duties. It's very enriching. It's great for the resume. This is where we are going as a country. I'm firmly convinced of that. People are learning new skills and they're using them on a day-to-day basis. We include the public in our conversation. We've had speaker series. We've brought in a couple of very powerful speakers about race. We brief the community on our racial equity impact analysis outcomes, why we are doing what we're doing, how we're doing what we're doing, a little bit like this. We share this information with the public. The Department of Race and Equity has a website. It's small, but it has a lot of interesting things on it, and we keep working on building it out because we want it to be better and better so that people can just go there and see what we're doing, how we're doing it, see some resources and that sort of thing. So we work with the public and as well as people inside a little bit. More focus internally, but we are accessible and as transparent as we possibly can be with the public. Ongoing technical assistance from my department for departments and leadership as they work to learn how to do this work in a different way, how to use the tools, etc. We walk with them, we work with them, particularly on major projects, but really whenever we're asked. And we help them identify things to work on. If they can't figure out where to start, we can make suggestions about where they could look for systemic change, where they could look. There's some key areas, and we kind of focus them on those key areas. And we start to, kind of turn things around and look at them and under the rock and so on and so forth. We go through that process with departments and with leadership in departments to help them get started. And then we coach people on how to measure their impacts. And we're learning more and more about data collection. This is not the strength of our city, of most cities, honestly. But we are getting experience with it, and we're learning as we go. We sometimes get outside technical assistance from some of the learning institutions around us and so on to help us think about how to use data better and on an ongoing basis to understand what our progress is looking like. So the way we think about it is no justice, no peace on both levels. We know that this will keep coming up for healing. Bad things will continue to happen in people of color's lives, in some of them very catastrophic and immediate, some of them slow and just as devastating. And we know that this uprising that we're experiencing right now, it will die down for a while, but unless we make significant progress, it will be back. And that's not what we want. We want a different kind of society. We want a different life, at least for future generations, if not for ourselves, where this is not the landscape, but where justice is the landscape. So thank you so much for giving me this time, and I'm going to stop there and see if there are questions. That is our quick overview of the work in the city of Oakland. We do a 15, 16-hour training for employees that are doing this work, for the equity teams and others who are interested, and go into much greater depth in all these areas. This is a very high-level overview, so I've probably raised as many questions for you as I've given you answers, but it's a place to start the conversation. Questions? Jess, how's it going? Was that okay?
That was great. I mean, I've seen you do this before, so.
It wasn't a surprise for you.
No, but you had some new stuff in there. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
This was, for me, I feel like just the more I hear folks talk about this stuff, the easier it gets to talk about it too. So I really appreciate that. I have a lot of questions. I don't want to monopolize. I guess my sort of first question is, let's see, what's the best one to ask? I feel like I'm curious if there are, you mentioned data, for example, and data is something that we work with a lot. We've talked about a lot, and we've had projects that work with data and that have, where we've had conversations around the implications of the data collection, the data sets, the source of the data. I'm curious, I would love to hear more about, on the city side, your experience with that, and wondering sort of how might an organization like ours help with that, and what kind of things. I mean, I'm thinking in terms of like, okay, well, how do we help our membership understand the issues around inequity and how inequity gets embedded in data, and also how we might unembed that stuff. But then also just how, like, are there places in the city where you feel like, in the city as in the administration, where you feel like we might be able to help or provide some kind of support in the work that you're doing around data and data collection?
Well, I'll give you an example. The kinds of challenges we have in the city of Oakland are pretty much system driven. I do think has been a lack of political will behind that to actually collect disaggregated data, but the census collects data points about demographics, and this is like that. I mean, we do want to know who we're serving, who we're not serving. So we have, for example, in contracting, the cities spend millions and millions of dollars over time that go into the pockets of businesses who contract with the city of Oakland. And I recently learned, much to my surprise, because I thought we had this data, because sometimes we have it and sometimes we don't, but I was not able to pull data in the city of Oakland about architects and what the demographics of the architects were that we hire. And I was asked to do that by a constituent who is a Black architect, who says to me, Black architects aren't getting any work from the city of Oakland. And we're about to give up on you. We do better in other cities and other jurisdictions than we do with the city of Oakland. And you all just apparently don't want to do business with Black architects. I think that's a legitimate conversation, and I was really happy to have that conversation with him. But I wanted to know, what's the data behind that? I didn't just want to speculate. So how many Black architects have we contracted with in the last 5 years? I asked that simple question. They had to pull that information by hand out of files. They did have the demographic information because we collect it for various reasons. We've collected it for a long time, but we did not have we couldn't produce a report on an automated basis. So we're now in the process of looking for a way or building a system that data off of spreadsheets can be uploaded so that we can produce reports that shows who we're contracting with and who we're not. It's that kind of thing. It really is a systems problem, because in fact, we were able to pull the data, but we had to pull every contract to know, or we didn't actually have to pull a contract, but we had to pull a cover. There's a spreadsheet for every contract, and we had to pull the spreadsheet, but we didn't have an automated way to roll out a report. So it took us way too much time, right, to be able to answer that question. That's a very fundamental question for equity, because if we are not doing business with Black architects, then we can investigate that and say, well, what's happening? What's wrong? What's going wrong? Where are they washing out? Or what's keeping them from this opportunity? Is it something about our systems? What's happening? But we can't investigate something if we don't have the data that tells us how we're doing.
Well, and it sounds like it really damages the city as a whole, because then we lose those skill sets when they go elsewhere to places where they're better received. So
that's right. They're getting work. They're just not getting work with us, and so we're not benefiting from their skill, their talent, and in fact, their support of the city, their goodwill toward the city of Oakland. Yeah.
And it sounds like this question of like, how do we get from a manual collection and processing system to something that's more automated? This comes up a lot, I feel like. And I know, it's something that we're working on with the West Oakland Air Quality Project, trying to get air quality data from these devices, these sensors, into a system that is usable by people so they can access that information. I have to wonder, there's got to be like you said, it's systemic. And so how do we work with how might we support agencies in sort of developing those automation processes? What constraints do city agencies work with that we might be able to solve for using technology?
I think it's a really rich conversation. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in it, because sometimes it can be very specific, like with air quality or whatever. It can be a very specific area, and there's not always even an off-the-shelf product or whatever, however you want to think about it, that you can plug it into, because it's so unique and so specific. And that's where I think you all could be quite helpful. I know in our police data, one of the things that Dr. Eberhardt from Stanford did was and sometimes it gets this interesting. She and her team wrote an algorithm that could analyze body camera data from stops. So we know that there's huge disparities in who gets stopped and what they get stopped for in Oakland and across the country. Oakland's not different. We're very much a part of the same sort of systemic mechanisms. And they wrote an algorithm that was able to analyze tens of thousands of hours of body camera data to see what the variables were in the data. And what they found was, you may have read about it because they did release the study, very different kinds of interactions between police officers and Black people and police officers and white people. How they talked to them, what words they used, how they approached them, whether or not they said, have a good day at the end of, how respectful. And they were able to see some really strong patterns of bias in the way that people talked to Black people when they stopped them. So on top of getting stopped more than anyone else, they're getting dealt with in a disrespectful way. So you can see how that could escalate and lead to a catastrophe. And that's sometimes exactly how it happens. And that was would not have been possible. You could not have manually looked at all that data. You couldn't have, looked at all those hours of tape and been able to tell what was going on, but they were able to write an algorithm that did that. So the possibilities are endless, from little to ginormous, right?
Awesome. We have a couple of other questions. Felicia, do you want to ask yours, or do you want me to read it out?
Hi, thanks. As soon as I wrote it, I was a little bit like thinking, oh, I wish I could edit that out, because it's like so general and vague.
You can put a finer point on it here.
Well, I just said, how can the tech community contribute to equity, which is like, okay, you could be here for days talking about that, I suppose.
Opportunities.
Maybe what is a way that the tech community can contribute to equity? Maybe that's better. Okay, I'll be quiet now.
Yeah. Well, here's how I think it's going to happen, is I think you're going to build relationships in the city or out in the community with people who are interested in advancing racial equity. I think it starts with relationships. Even in my notes where I said how we're doing this work inside the city, we do a lot of training like this, a lot of theoretical framework that we share with people about how we do the work and why we do it that way and so on. But really what we're doing at the same time is we're building relationships. So the way that I ended up working with you, your organization, is that someone inside the city said, why don't you go to one of these tech nights, go to one of these code nights, these hack nights, and do a little pitch. And so I did my little pitch and I got my help, and it was fantastic. I mean, we really had a problem how we were going to do this thing that we wanted to do in the equity program for cannabis. And so I think it was through a relationship that I got there, and it was through relationships that I had access to y'all. And so I think we have to get outside of our box. That's the thing about the fence, is that we're inside our we're inside our organizations, we're inside our context, whatever that context is. And we actually have to get outside of our context and mix and mingle and just, rub shoulders with, be in proximity with people that we're not normally in proximity with, and particularly with people who are marginalized and have less access to tech. The digital divide is huge. And I don't know that I had this idea, I really did. I said, I want a match site, like a match site, but not for dating, for this cannabis process that we wanted to do. But would never have known who to talk to about that if you hadn't been there and someone hadn't directed me in your direction. Yes, if we had money, which we didn't, if we had a lot of money, I could have hired someone to do it. But oftentimes people who are doing justice work don't have a lot of resources, and they need people who can afford to help them without getting paid a lot of money. So you all are a resource. You all are, it's just could do so much work, but you probably don't have all the relationships that you need to have in order to connect with the people you need to connect with. So I don't know what that looks like. I don't in your world, but we could sure keep talking about it. How do you get out of your box and in proximity with people who need you and who would want to work with you? I know that is, maybe we need another match site. Oh yeah.
That's awesome.
Where people can find each other, right? It's about connection.
Yeah, thank you. That's an amazing answer. Very expensive, and it's given me a lot to think about. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sean, it looks like you had a question, and then Nils will get to yours next.
Well, thank you so much for taking your time to, chat with us and, share your thoughts and experience. I wanted to kind of build on what we were just talking about. And working in the nonprofit side, the hardest thing about, working in justice or equity is building a pipeline of not just supporters, but also advisors and stakeholders. How would you recommend to us that we build those kinds of relationships and constantly continue to cultivate new relationships? So that way we're not just thinking about now, but who is the community we want to think about for the next 5, 10, 20, 50 years? Mm-hmm. And how can we best serve them?
Well, it's a little bit like my answer to the last question. I think this is a learning experience. We know that tech is, so many people are isolated from technology. First of all, just access to technology. And second of all, access to some of the more technical skills that go into building out systems or processes that meet your needs. So I think what I would do, the way I would approach it, because I tend to be very structured, is think about who are the populations in the city of Oakland that are most underserved. And I can tell you those are Black, Indigenous people and Latinos. Also sometimes older people, you know who the underserved groups are. And then think about who do you have, I would say, who do you have the easiest access to? Who do you have the most immediate access to, and start to feel your way into those stakeholder relationships. Don't make it super hard. Start where you do have some connections, where you do know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, and where you start to follow those breadcrumbs into the stakeholder community. This is the key. They're not going to come to you most of the time. People who've been marginalized by racism and classism and so on are probably not going to come knock on your door, because they don't even know there is a door, first of all. And second of all, it's intimidating when you're starting from so far behind, and that doesn't feel good. So you want to build some relationships that can coach you into knowing people that you don't currently know. You can do it through faith organizations. You can do it through nonprofits. You can do it through small business assistance organizations that are trying to support small businesses. One of the things that has come up during COVID is how so many of the people of color owned and lower income small businesses in Oakland are not automated in any way, don't even have a website, don't have, aren't online, don't have don't have internet, I mean, and we know that there's ways to get that to people sometimes, but they don't know where to begin. So I don't know, but we could brainstorm that. I think that there's some activities in the city. Right now, we just launched some more work around small businesses and the recovery from COVID-19. I know there's a huge technical need there. More than maybe, I know there are people in our economic development department who probably have ideas about who you could be connecting with in the small business world, because they're trying to connect with those same folks. But they're not tech people, they're just small business people. They're people who do small business support. They could use more tech assistance. So there's probably some partnerships in the city in some key areas like that, economic development and some other places where we could help you get some entree, right? Because we're in there, and trust me, the city has the same struggle, but we're already working on connecting with those stakeholders. So we might be able to be doing some of that together. Partner up, that's what I would say.
Thank you, that's great. Yeah, that actually answered one of my questions as well, which was like, are there specific areas of work that the city is doing that could really benefit from?
Yeah, economic development, and then the school districts work with kids, with students. There's a lot of need, and we actually are putting out an RFP right now for a backbone CBO who does equity and tech a little bit, and to help us find smaller organizations to help families and kids. They're having a really tough time with remote learning in homes where tech is not, where there's a digital divide. And we've provided equipment now. We've done a pretty good job of pushing out equipment and hotspots and things like that, but people don't know how to turn these devices on. They don't know how to navigate the internet. They have a really tough time with the online learning programs. Sometimes language is a barrier. There's a lot of work to be done in that area too. So we're going to be trying to launch some digital literacy work. And I don't know, if some people like that kind of stuff. Some people don't. They want to be more involved with machines than people maybe, or whatever. But I know some of you probably would really, it's very gratifying work to unlock tech for people who've never been in there. It's just an amazing thing.
Well, we actually have a couple of folks on the call tonight. Alyssa and Laurel are both working on putting together a website for La Escuelita, a school here in the city that has struggled to sort of communicate with parents and their students. And they have also been looking at sort of how they might use that project as almost a template kind of this thing for other schools in the district. I don't know. We also have a couple of other questions, so I don't want to totally eat up time, but Alyssa or Laurel, if you have any thoughts on that.
I was just going to add, Darlene, that the last few sentences are just sending all kinds of ideas off in my head of treating this school project as almost an experiment and try to templatize it. The small business owners are something we haven't even thought of. It wasn't even on our radar. We've been focused on education. So I think that's a really great idea, and would just love to plug in more to anyone who you were mentioning about within the city side.
I can make those connections for you. Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
I love this. Nils, you had a question?
Hey, I just want to pause for a second here. We're at about an hour, and I just want to give people a chance to shuffle out if they want to break out to their project teams. Otherwise, stick around and keep having this conversation.
Thank you.
Nils, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to continue along the same thread. I think we're all interested in the same questions, and we've had a lot of evaluation of our projects recently in regards to having them all be connected to a community group or something outside of Open Oakland, so that we have feedback, so that we know what's going on with how we're working with a community in some way or another. So my question is if there was a compiled list of groups that might need help, or something that like specific or that we could just refer to and see if it matches up with projects or what the needs might be, or
that's that match site. I don't think the city is that sophisticated yet, but I do know that there are people in the city who are working with small business and on education related things that would be a start, because they do know the organizations that they're interacting with, or that they have begun to compile a stakeholder list. So, I mean, it's informal. But I think if we could get the right relationships between Open Oakland and people in the city that are externally focused on supporting some of these gaps, we could begin to build that out. It would be, but again, that's the best way to do it anyway. A list, then you'd have to cold call the list, right? Relationships are so much better than cold calling. And so if you do it by interacting with people that are already connected to people, then that gives you the entry, and that tends to lead to more, right? And then there's this one, and then there's that one. You're kind of following the breadcrumb thing that organizers do. So start to think of yourselves as organizers.
All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thomas, and then we've got one from David.
Hey, Darlene, thanks so much for being here and for sticking around to answer our questions. So I was curious if you could tell us just a little bit your thoughts or maybe some examples of measurements that we could be looking at when looking at the kind of impact of our work, like what to measure.
Well, there's three. We strive, and we don't have this completely, we're not experts at it, but we do have a model that we're using. We try to measure on three levels. The simple ones, and the ones we most usually do, is how much service did we deliver, and was the service quality or not? Did it meet our quality standards? Did we have some sort of a metric that we're doing it well, and what's our standard for that? So that's one area of measurement. The third one is, did it make a difference in people's lives? And this is where you want to circle back with the people you serve periodically, whoever that might be, whether it's city staff like myself or people in the community, to find out, ask for feedback. Whoever said feedback, they're looking for feedback. Ask for feedback. People will give you feedback. And then the other thing is disaggregate the data as much as possible so that you can know, are you serving women as well as you're serving men? Are you serving people of color as well as you're serving white folks? So collect a little demographic data, which is a skill to get that demographic data, but it's possible. I have found over time that when I'm doing a survey, like a customer satisfaction survey is one way of finding out how well your people are feeling served, that you add on at the end of that some demographic questions. So that you can find out if there's a variable across your data, your service data, that relates to race or gender or something else. And so just think through your data collection. Think of this as data collection and how you're going to use it and how you're going to know whether or not you have a high, medium, or low level of customer satisfaction, because that's really what matters. And that's why capitalists measure that stuff so carefully, because that's what matters. Is like, it's not just, it's not just, did I get what I came for? It was, what was my experience? And, would I go back again? And, that's the kind of stuff you want to reach for. So think of yourselves not only as organizers, but as marketers, because you really want to know what works and what doesn't work for your user, for your customer. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much.
And David.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the great presentation, Darlene. I learned a lot.
Okay.
Hey, I just had a quick question, kind of akin to the whole match site thread. Are there organizations, nonprofits that advance BIPOC people in tech who we might be interested in engaging in as well?
Oh, there definitely are, and they're growing, and particularly in this part of the country. We might be able to come up with a list of those for you, because we've been thinking about them for this literacy project. How, we definitely want to make sure that we're reaching out to Black, Indigenous, people of color who are doing this work to help us do the literacy work, because obviously the relationship building and the motivation there should be pretty good. So we're putting together a list. It's not super long, but I think you all should definitely be talking to them and getting feedback from them, or maybe feedback isn't the right, advice, getting advice from them about how to be a better service organization for other than the main clientele that typically show up.
All right,
So it looks like that's our last question in the chat. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to ask or share? I want to be conscious of time, and I'm really thankful that you have stayed so long to spend this time with us. I appreciate it deeply. I feel like this has been a really great conversation, and even the Q&A, I feel like I can kind of see the light bulbs going off and behind the screens. Does anybody have any sort of final questions or thoughts they want to share before we allow Darlene to return to her partner and her life?
My curry, yeah. Well, and I can come back too. So think about this, begin to look at your strategic plan, build some elements in, and then we can come back and we can talk about it some more. Also, maybe I'll talk with my folks as we're moving through our little tech project, a digital literacy project that we're trying to launch, about other people that you might be talking to, because I'm just one aspect of this. I think there are many views are better than just one about your work, and I think you keep talking to people. I just can't we have a tendency, because of our socialization, Western socialization is very individualistic, and we think we have to come up with all the answers and always be the smartest person in the room and know everything, and that's not really the best model. It turns out that equity, inclusion, and having lots of different voices in the room is the best model for getting the answers right. So I strongly encourage you to keep talking to people, because more light bulbs will come on, more ideas will come on as you interface with people who bring different perspectives. And you do get to bring your thinking to it too, but now you're juiced by something you haven't thought about before. And that's how creativity really blossoms, is through that exchange and that synergy from people who are coming from different disciplines, but who all want the same thing at the end of the day.
Yeah. I think tech in particular really struggles with getting outside its own bubble. And so I think that's particularly going to be a particular challenge for us just ongoing. So the next sort of phase of this evening is I'd like to take 15 or 20 minutes. Whoever wants to stay should feel welcome to stay, including you, Darlene, if you're up for it, but you should not feel obligated. But I would love to spend some time kind of brainstorming how some of these ideas and concepts that Darlene's talked about with us how we might bring that into the work that we're doing, and maybe start answering some of these questions that were raised as well. So I think we can just use this main room, maybe. Thomas, Andrew.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm going to sign out just because I've put off my social time with my partner long enough, and he's very patient with me. But I want to spend a little bit of time with him before I collapse. And know that I'm here at the city, and so I'm an ongoing resource. We can talk again later. I'm so excited.
Well, and likewise, if we can ever be of service, and if there's, if you have a need that comes up that we're here every week, and you have my contact info. And so we definitely are, that's what we're here for, quite literally. And so I definitely encourage you to use us as you need to.
And do reach out to me for some contacts in the city and some of these.
Yeah, I'll follow up and connect you with some of the folks on tonight's call. Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much for spending this time with me.